Hello, friends. My name is Ty, and I'm going to read to you. This story is called What It Means to Bleed. This is the first story that I ever wrote that was published. It was the first runner up in the 2010 Surrey International Writers Conference writing contest, and I was very proud to be published in their anthology. So here we go. Cale looked down the hill at the teeming mass of bodies. "They're coming again," he said to the man next to him. There was no response. He glanced over and saw the lieutenant's uniform was shredded and the officer was wearing his guts like a wedding sash. Cale shrugged. At least he wouldn't be plagued by the man's endless griping about his wet feet. He stood, tightened the straps on his shield, and plunked his battered helmet back on his bloody head. "Arm yourselves!" he called to the men behind him, who looked up wearily from where they were binding their wounds and cursing the gods. They were good soldiers, the lot of them, but they were green and inexperienced. Most of them had never seen battle before, and even the best could only stand so long against what waited them at the bottom of the hill. Cale took account of what was left. 24, perhaps 3 if you counted the ones that were still trying to stand despite their missing limbs. A poor number for a last stand against the thousands that were coming. "This is it, lads," he shouted, trying to force bravado into his voice that he did not remotely feel. "Let's show them what it means to set a menacing foot on our soil. Show them what it means to bleed." A ragged cheer went up behind him, or perhaps just an enthusiastic groan, as the worn-out soldiers hefted their worn-out weapons and cast their drooping eyes down the hill at the enemy. "We hold the high ground, boys," Cale said with more false confidence. The men around him needed to hear it, false or otherwise, or they'd break and run and be cut down anyway. "Better we die well, yelling in the face of the enemy, than to be remembered a coward with a knife in your back." The enemy boiled up the hill towards them, countless in their number and awful in their intent. They were gray-bodied predators. The scalps of the dead draped their shoulders, and the flesh of Cale's countrymen filled their bellies. "Hold the line, lads. Don't let them through." Cale almost let out a chuckle at the foolishness of his words, exhaustion and grief getting the better of him. Their line was only a score of paces long, and the front rank of the enemy, if those savages could be said to have ranks, was nearly 3 times that. "We have to buy the city enough time to dig in and hold the walls." That much was true, although he couldn't help the bitter thought that if the city's regent had sent a proper number of men out to the field to meet the enemy, instead of a token band of infantry, then this might be a proper battle instead of a massacre. Cale had tried to tell the lieutenant, who was so stylishly wearing his own innards, it was folly to send so few men, but in the end had volunteered to join the fools anyway. There was a boy next to Cale with no more than a fine wisp of golden hair on his chin. He was shaking so badly that his short sword was rattling against his shield. "Steady, lad," Cale growled, hoping it was a reassuring sound. "I'm scared, Sarge." "We all are, boy. So take that fear, hang it on the end of your sword, and drive it into the eye of the first bastard that comes near you." The boy nodded, his ill-fitting helmet falling over his eyes. The enemy was close enough for Cale to smell their stench, unwashed bodies covered in rotting skin, and it made him want to gag. He kept his jaw clenched and breathed through his grinding teeth, willing his stomach to keep its meager contents down. He stepped a pace ahead of the others, making himself into the point of a wedge, and raised his axe in the air so the others could see him. "Honor, lads," he shouted. "Honor in the face of these godless bastards. Show them what it means to be men." They were close enough now that he could count the scalps on the foremost of them. He gripped his axe tighter and spread his feet, and wondered for a moment why he'd volunteered for this. For a wasted death on a barren hill that no one would remember an hour from now. Then he shrugged again. Thoughts like that seldom got a man like him anywhere. It was best to stick with what he knew: bleeding and the shedding of blood. The fastest of them leapt a boulder 5 paces away and charged at Cale. A crude stone hammer held over its head, a howl giving voice to its fury. Cale shifted forward with a howl of his own, swinging his axe low to cut into the creature's guts. Their 2 huge bodies slammed together, and Cale screamed out in rage and pain. There was a flash of white light all around him, and a sound in his ears like the winds at the top of a watchtower. The body he was thrusting against disappeared, and he lost his balance and fell to the ground, his shield arm pinned beneath him. He rolled onto his back frantically, his eyes closed against the white light and his shoulders hunched as he tried to bring his axe up, expecting the bite of a stone hammer. No blow came, and gradually the light faded and allowed his squinting eyes to open. There was no yellow-tusked face above him, no clawed hands trying to rip his helmet to get it to his scalp. He sat up and looked around him. He was alone on the hill. Cale stood, his shield arm hanging limp at his side, and his axe drooping from nerveless fingers. Everyone was gone. The enemy, the soldiers around him, the dead lieutenant and his surcoat of bowels. The hill was wiped clean. He stared over the recent field of battle and let his bearded chin drop slack toward his chest. A brisk tapping behind him, and the exaggerated clearing of a throat, caused him to spin. His shield snapped into place and he raised his axe above his shoulder and peered over the rim of the shield looking for the source of the noise. There, on the rock he'd recently occupied, was a plain-looking man in brown robes. The man was looking down at a slate tablet in his hand, while he tapped a broad piece of chalk against the edge impatiently. As Cale examined him, he noticed something strange about the man's mundane appearance. His common face was completely devoid of any wrinkles, or lines, or blemishes. He was plain, yet perfect. And in that perfection, Cale found him terrifying. "Who in the blue hells are you?" Cale asked. He did his best to make it sound like a threatening growl, but it came out more of a concerned croak. "Hell is not blue," the man said, peering down at his nose at the tablet. "In fact, it's not much of a color at all. And there is only one. I don't know why you people get the idea that there's so many of them." Cale's shield sagged a little. What?" The man looked up and met Cale's eyes for the first time, and Cale took a step back. They were completely white, like that of a blind man, but he was meeting Cale's worried stare evenly. "You are Cale, Sergeant of the Four Cities?" "I am," Cale said. "And who are you? Better yet, what in the unblue hell happened, and where am I?" "My name," the man said, as he turned his eyes back to the tablet, "is unimportant, and more to the point, incomprehensible to you." "What happened?" you asked. "You were chopped down in battle against your enemy, and now you stand before me." The man turned his milk-white eyes back to Cale. "What have you to say for yourself?" Cale stood from his fighting crouch and let his shield arm drop. This odd little man certainly could not be counted as friendly, but he didn't have any aggression in him either. It was more like a mild disdain, or perhaps exaggeration, that Cale felt radiating off him in vaguely disinterested waves. "What do you mean, what have I got to say for myself?" The man shrugged. "This is your chance to make your point, to tell me your side of your life." Cale wrinkled his dark brow. "Am I being judged? Is this my day of judgment?" The man shrugged again. Cale shook his head. "Oh, no. This is not what I was promised when I took up my shield for my country. I was told when I died an honorable death I would stand before the warrior gods, and they would judge whether I was fit for the ranks of the noble dead or not. No, I'll wait for them, thank you. I'll not be judged by some wide-eyed clerk in frumpy robes." "Who said anything about an honorable death?" the man asked, watching Cale calmly. "And that whole thing about the warrior gods is really more of a myth than anything that really happens." The man stood and walked towards Cale, again tapping his chalk piece on the tablet. "And I assure you I am far more than a clerk." "What the hell are you then?" The man stopped walking. "Isn't it obvious?" "No." The man shrugged again. "Regardless, you've got to answer for your crimes. Do you wish to hear them?" "Crimes?" Cale sputtered. "What damn crimes? I've never been before a magistrate in all my days." The man snorted. "I'm not speaking of anything so simple as magistrate's law. I'm talking about the crimes against your people, crimes for which only the gods can judge." "Bring them on," Cale said, propping his axe on his shoulder and dropping his shield to lean against his leg. "I'll answer for any crimes you care to name, to gods or men." "Cowardice," the man said, his first on the list. "What is your defense?" "Cowardice? Defense? I've never stepped away from a fight since I was old enough to walk. If you know so much about me, you'll see that plainly." "Fighting, Cale, is easy. I'm talking about cowardice on a much higher level. What did you think of this battle, about sending a single regiment of untested infantry against the hordes of the enemy? It was a fool's quest, doomed from the start. We were sent here to die. So, the man held his tablet against his chest, smearing a little chalk against his brown robe. You knew that this would be a death sentence, yet you didn't speak up. That, to me, is obvious cowardice. I did speak up, Kale shouted, his face burning beneath his beard. I told the officer in charge of this mess that it was a mistake, that it'd be nothing more than a dance of blood. He wouldn't listen. The man snorted again. You told the officer in charge, did you? The brave lieutenant who threw down his shield and buried his face in his hands at the first charge of the enemy? The one that could barely buckle on his own sword. And you didn't have the sand to talk back to a fruit fly? Yes, that took great daring indeed. You never mentioned a word to anyone who mattered, or who could make a decision. You let these men. There was another flash, and the bodies of Kale's dead comrades appeared on the hill, complete with a stench of blood and shit. March to their deaths, when you knew what they faced, and you agreed to go with them, rather than stay and live, and be burdened always with the weight of their deaths. If that is not cowardice, then you must tell me what is. Bastard, Kale shouted, and flung his shield to the ground with a great clang. You twist things. That is not what happened, and you know it. Do I? Aye, you do, you milk-eyed son of a whore. The regent will not hear an enlisted man. He will not have one speak in his presence on pain of death. The man must go through his officer, and that, Kale pointed to the lieutenant, whose lung was serving as a necktie, was the only officer whose ear I had. I told him that it was a waste of lives, that he was sending a handful of boys to be slaughtered by savages, and they'd be better spent at home, guarding the walls. Either that, or make a proper job of it, and send the whole army, and stop the enemy before they got close to the capital to even glimpse the flags on the towers. If that's what you thought, why did you ask to go? You've got service in the army. They'd have let you stay if you asked. Because they were only boys, Kale shouted, standing over the blonde-haired youth who had been rattling beside him only moments ago. The regent kept all the veterans to guard the damned walls, and sent these soft-footed lads to face an enemy that most of them couldn't even dream of. I went so there would be at least one voice of reason on the line, at least one man who knew what he was about. So you're saying this is an act of bravery, not cowardice? The man pursed his lips. I wasn't trying to be brave, Kale said, exasperated. I was just trying to help, to maybe keep some of these boys alive so that I have a chance to grow more than ass fuzz on their chins. Interesting, the man said, and looked down at his tablet. He scratched a few characters with his piece of chalk. What about the other accusations? What other accusations? The crime of indifference, the man said, looking down at his slate and ticking something off. You've a wife and 2 sons back in the city. You failed them with your inability to speak, and you failed them with your death. I can only assume that you were indifferent to their lives, that you would cast yours away and leave them alone. A rage, deep and murderous, seized hold of Kale, and he had raised his axe high for a killing stroke and stepped towards the wide-eyed man. You dare speak of my wife, my boys? Accuse me of being indifferent to them? I should kill you where you stand. The man did not flinch away, but only raised one thin eyebrow. Should you? If you're not indifferent, then what are you? What am I? Kale slashed his axe through the air, flinging himself around. What am I, you bastard? I'm a man suffering. I'm a man who won't see his sons grow tall enough to hold a shield. A man who will never feel the warmth of his wife. I did it for them, not in spite of them. I stood in this field to give them a chance at life. I did it from my love for them. If you think otherwise, then you're as blind as your eyes make you look. The man smirked, marked something else down in his tablet. What of your final crime? Oh, I'll bet this will be a good one. Kale stopped, propping his axe on his shoulder. What is it then? Let's have it. Failure, the man said. Failure at your duty. Failed to complete the task you claim you took on with courage and love. What of that? Failure. Kale threw his head back and laughed into the reeking sky. You speak of failure. You might know how to chalk that tablet, but you know nothing of battle. To have lasted more than a heartbeat, to have held the line against that first charge was a mighty victory. We sent 200 men, most of whom had never shed a drop of blood before, against a host of savage thousands. To march them up this hill without most of them shitting their pants or fleeing was a mighty conquest. No, you can take your failure and shove it in your narrow ass. The man nodded slightly and made a few more marks on his tablet. Very well, then. You've made your arguments. Is there anything you've learned? Learned? Cale asked. He scratched at his beard with split and bloody fingers and turned from the man, humming in thought. I don't know what I've learned. I wish I'd done things different, but wishing don't make it so. Yes? And what would you have done different? Cale shrugged. If I had to do it over again, knowing that I'd be killed on this treeless hill and have to stand here listening to you, I'd have shouted at the regent. I'd have grabbed his scarlet coat and shaken him till his shining teeth rattled. He'd have heard the truth, even if it cost my life. Better that it be spent there, on the council floor, and save the lives of these lads, than all of us be wasted on this bloody hill. Is that truly what you would do, Cale? By all the gods, it is. Perhaps we should see. The man waved his hand once, a smooth gesture with his palm towards the ground, and a familiar white light flashed in Cale's vision, and a violent wind filled his ears. It was brief this time, and then it cleared. Cale was standing on the floor of the council room of the capital of the four cities. He was dressed in his best regimental tunic, and none of the wounds that had been paining him only moments ago remained. When his hearing returned, he could hear the voice of the soft lieutenant, his guts once again on the right side of his skin, making vague arguments in his ear. We can't tell him that, Cale, the lieutenant whined. He doesn't want to hear it. He's a stubborn man and he's made up his mind. By all the blue hells, if I tell him that, he'd kill us both. Hell isn't blue, Cale said, looking over the lieutenant's shoulder at where the regent was shaking hands and flashing bright political smiles at his counselors. What? The lieutenant said. Oh, be damned, Cale growled, and shoved the lieutenant away from him. The simpering man squawked and sprawled onto the floor. Cale charged across the broad council chamber, shouldering through the throngs of aristocrats and ass-kissers, straight at the regent. One startled-looking guard stepped in Cale's path. You can't, the man stopped talking when Cale's fist smashed into his face, relieving him of several teeth. Cale jumped over the guard as he fell and slammed into the regent, bearing him to the floor. Cale righted himself and knelt over the winded governor and seized the front of his scarlet tunic in two meaty fists. Listen to me, damn you, Cale shouted as he shook the man, causing his finely combed hair to fly around his face. If you send the light infantry, it will be a mission of death. All of them, to a man, will be slaughtered on that hill and the city will be exposed even worse than it is now. Either keep them all here on the walls to protect the city, or send the whole army out to meet the enemy and stop them where they stand. Anything else will be death for us. All of us. Cale stood and hauled the regent to his feet and set the man right. Everyone watching was too stunned to move, and the regent himself simply stared at Cale, his eyes wide in surprise. Only the guard Cale had smashed to the ground had enough sense to speak. Arrest him, the guard shouted, spitting blood and teeth down the front of his uniform, for assaulting the regent. Assaulting sounded more like a shawling, but those ringed around got the idea. Several other guards moved to grab Cale, and he simply held his arms out and waited. Perhaps he'd only be flogged and not hanged if he didn't resist. But the regent stepped in front of him. Stop, the regent shouted, holding out his manicured hands to stop the advancing guards. He turned to Cale. Have you fought these creatures before? He looked down at the sleeve of Cale's tunic at the stripes of rank. Sergeant? Aye, Lord, Cale said cautiously, wondering if more words would get him in more trouble or out of it. I served in the Northern Border Wars for many years. And what do you recommend? What did you say your name was? Cale, sire. Right. What do you recommend, Sergeant Cale? Cale swallowed thickly. He'd expected to be beaten, not questioned. The enemy will come in force, Lord. But if we send the whole army and meet them in strength, I believe we can win. Dividing the army, even the smallest part of it, is folly and will only lead to our doom. The regent rubbed his smooth chin and nodded. What you say makes sense, Sergeant. I don't think I want to die any more than anyone else. I prize my skin very highly indeed. That drew a cautious laugh from the courtiers around him. You and you, the regent pointed to two senior military commanders. Prepare the army to march immediately. He turned back to Cale. And get this man a new uniform. There should be a captain's crest where those sergeant stripes are. I'll need an experienced soldier to lead this campaign. One who will tell me the truth about things from time to time, unlike these simpering fools that prance about my court. I trust you're that man, Captain? I, sire? The regent ignored the question in Cale's voice. Very good, he said and spun away, shouting orders at his advisors. There was another white flash in his vision. When it cleared, Cale was once again on the murderous hill, staring down into the writhing mass of the enemy. This time, however, the hill was not littered with the bodies of his fallen countrymen, but was covered in broad lines of his own army. He found himself on a tall horse, burnished armor on his chest, and his old axe in his hand. He looked to his left and right and paused. The men on either side of him were utterly and completely still, like statues made of flesh. Even the horse beneath him did not sway or even breathe. It was as if the world had changed, then froze mid-breath. So, Cale, a voice behind him said, is this a better outcome? Cale turned in the saddle to see the wide-eyed man standing at his stirrup. I thought this was a day of judgment, he said, not second chances. The man shrugged. You're the one who said you were being judged, not me. I was only here to see that you'd had enough sense to take hold of a second chance were you given one. I guess we got our answer. Cale leaned over in his saddle. Who in the hells that aren't blue are you? The man looked down at the enemy. There are many gods and godlings that roam this world, Cale. Like men, some have purpose and others don't. Today I believe that in giving you the briefest of moments to change your mind, that I've fulfilled my purpose. The rest... He flicked the greave on Cale's shin with a faint ring. It's up to you. Aye, Cale said. That it is. He looked down on the mass of the enemy. So do any of you godlings have names? He looked back to where the man had been standing. But there was only a patch of rocky ground. As he turned back, the motion of the army started all around him, all at once. And the sound of men and horses filled his ears, along with the whine of the enemies howling in the distance. He wondered, as the world came alive, who the wide-eyed man was, and why he'd done what he had. Then again, he thought, some things it was better to accept than spend too much time questioning. On your word, Captain, a man, a veteran with a notched shield, growled at his elbow. Aye, Cale said, and flicked down the visor to his helmet. Honor, lads, he shouted, thrusting his axe in the air. Show them what it means to bleed. I really hope you guys liked that story. I had a lot of fun writing it, and it was a lot of fun to read it here for you now. If you want to find out more about my writing and my work, go to my website, www.tynergillis.com. That's TYNERGILLIES. And you can find more about me there. Thanks so very much.